The rest of the world, international law and its binding obligations are taken for granted, but no such binding obligation can apply to the United States. That follows from the fact that the accumulating force of international law interferes with Washington's freedom to act as it chooses, and will even more dramatically impede us in the future. Treaties are not legal obligations for the United States, but at most, political commitments. Therefore, contrary to what others mistakenly believe, it was quite appropriate for Washington to refuse to pay its UN dues from the Reagan years until 2001, when Washington changed course, because it then needed international support. True, at Washington's initiative, the World Court ruled in 1962 that payment of UN dues is obligatory for members, but that ruling was applied to official enemies, and it was delivered before the World Court was disqualified by disagreeing with Washington. Nor does it matter that the U.S. share of UN dues has always been below a rate that would accurately reflect U.S. economic strength. The reasoning throughout is straightforward, and is in full accord with what Bush calls new thinking in the law of war, which takes international law and treaties to be private contractual rules that the more powerful party is free to apply or disregard as it sees fit. Sternly enforced to ensure a safer world for investors, but quaint and obsolete when they constrain Washington's resort to aggression and other crimes. It would only be fair to add that in these respects the Bush administration is within the approved spectrum, which is quite narrow. The new thinking had been clearly formulated at the opposite extreme of the spectrum by the most prominent among the liberal wise men who are honored for having created the modern order. Senior statesman and Kennedy advisor Dean Acheson. In January 1963, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Acheson instructed the American Society of International Law that no legal issue arises when the United States responds to a challenge to its power, position, and prestige, as in Cuba. Acheson was surely aware that the international terrorist war that was a significant factor in driving the world to the brink of disaster had been quickly resumed by Kennedy when the missile crisis was resolved. It would not be easy to conjure up a more straightforward enunciation of the new thinking, which throughout history has been among the prerogatives of overwhelming power. The fabric of law on which survival rests. Returning to the inescapable question posed by Russell and Einstein, another prominent strategic analyst who joins in the warnings of nuclear catastrophe is Michael Maguire. He writes that under current policies, largely driven by Washington, a nuclear exchange is ultimately inevitable, following the dreadful logic that should be familiar to anyone concerned with the fate of the species. If present trends persist, he argues, we are virtually certain to see a return to nuclear arms racing involving intercontinental ballistic systems and space-based assets, offensive and defensive, reactivating the danger of inadvertent nuclear war, with a probability that will be extremely high. As a step toward reducing the danger, he urges Britain to abandon its useless nuclear weapons, by now merely the lace curtains of our political poverty. But the crucial choices, as everyone knows, are made in Washington. Comparing the two crises that literally threaten survival, Maguire has this to say: by comparison with global warming, the cost of eliminating nuclear weapons would be small, but the catastrophic results of global nuclear war would greatly exceed those of progressive climate change, because the effects would be instantaneous and could not be mitigated. The irony of the situation is that it is in our power to eliminate the threat of global nuclear war, but climate change cannot be evaded. The phrase, "our power," again, refers primarily to the United States. McGuire's immediate concern was the NPT and the regular 5-year review conference scheduled for May 2005, but more generally, the threat to survival resulting from the dismantling of the rule of law. Reflecting on the Iraq invasion, he writes, "There were many reasons, political, military, legal, ethical, and economic, for concluding before the event that the decision to wage war on Iraq was fundamentally flawed. But in the longer term, by far the most important was that such an operation, and the reasoning that led to the decision to undertake it, threatened to undermine the very fabric of international relations. That decision repudiated a century of slow, intermittent, and often painful progress towards an international system based on cooperative security, multilateral decision-making, collective action, agreed norms of behavior, and a steadily growing fabric of law, which is being torn to shreds by the world's most powerful state, now a self-declared outlaw state, taking perilous steps toward ultimate doom. The success of the effort to eliminate the threat of global nuclear war depends significantly on the effectiveness of the NPT. As McGuire writes, the NPT used to be seen as an unexpectedly successful example of international cooperation, but by now it is more like a wisdom tooth that is rotten at its root, and the abscess is poisoning the international body politic. The NPT was based on 2 central agreements. In return for renouncing the option of acquiring nuclear weapons for themselves, non-nuclear weapon states were promised, first, unimpeded access to nuclear energy for non-military use, and second, progress on nuclear disarmament by the 5 acknowledged nuclear weapon states, the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, France, and China. At the May 2005 review conference, Washington's goal was to rescind both promises. That stand naturally reinforces the cynical view, McGuire writes, that whatever the original intentions, the NPT is now a convenient instrument of U.S. foreign policy. A good case can be made for Washington's call for restricting Article 4 of the NPT, which grants non-nuclear states the right to produce uranium fuel for reactors, bringing them, with contemporary technology, to just a step away from nuclear weapons. But to be more than mere cynicism, any such agreement would have to ensure unimpeded access for non-military use, in accord with the initial bargain between declared nuclear powers and the non-nuclear states under the NPT. One reasonable proposal to this end was put forth by Nobel Peace Prize laureate Mohammed El-Baradei, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. El-Baradei suggested that all production and processing of weapon-usable material be restricted exclusively to facilities under multinational control, and should be accompanied above all by an assurance that legitimate would-be users could get their supplies. That should be the first step, he argued, toward fully implementing the 1993 UN resolution calling for a Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, FMCT, FIS ban, which could cap and make public all inventories of fissile material still available, and serve as a starting point for future arms reductions. This call for a halt to the production of fissile materials for weapons, writes the distinguished Princeton arms control specialist Frank N. von Hippel, is the most fundamental nuclear arms control proposal, putting a ceiling on the number of nuclear weapons that can be made. A second crucial step would be the fulfillment of the pledge of the nuclear states to eliminate nuclear weapons. El-Baradei's proposal, regrettably, was dead in the water. The U.S. political leadership, surely in its current stance, would never agree to the first step, thereby abrogating its unique exemption from international law and treaty obligations. And the more general framework remains mere words, as we see directly, and is likely to remain so unless